Hey everybody, happy Monday. It's a new week and today we're going to be talking about how to help native speakers, help you learn a language more effectively. So we're going to start by just doing a bit of background and framing the problem, but then we're going to approach this from, what I have found to be the most effective question to ask a native speaker that helps them intuitively give you more helpful advice and more helpful responses. And then I'm going to sort of talk about how to, get feedback from people who you're interacting with on a regular basis in a way that I have also found to be very effective. So lots of cool stuff coming up. Let's jump in. Okay, so the general problem here is something that I think anyone who's been learning a language for a long time and has interacted with native speakers for help has probably run into, which is pretty quickly you start to realize that it's actually not that easy for a native speaker to explain things about their language to a learner, right? Now, many of you, and me included, we have experienced this ourselves, right? So you may have had friends who are speaking or learning English as a second language, and they ask you certain things, and sometimes they have the most fascinating questions, and you realize very quickly, I have no idea, right? So on one hand, there's this idea of asking for explanations of how things work, but on the other hand, there's another problem, which is that very often, we figure out, okay, it's not so easy for native speakers to help us if they don't have some kind of pedagogical training, if they haven't done this before. But we also figure out over time that sometimes it's difficult to help someone understand what information you're actually looking for. Now, I think this varies between different languages, but also different cultures, right? So in the case of Japanese, for example, I was learning Japanese for a long time, and that's a language where there's often a very formal way to say something, right? There might be sort of an informal way to say something. Then there's a slang way to say something, which is a level lower. There's even a level above formal, right? We call this keigo in Japanese. So it's a very honorific way of speaking. So there is like all these different ways of expressing certain ideas, and each different way would be appropriate in very different contexts. And the thing about Japanese that I've also, often found is that if you just ask someone, how do you say X? They tend to default to telling you the sort of formal way to say it. So that's their default, right? Because they want to make sure that you don't accidentally, say something very informally in the wrong context, and maybe you're going to get, in a bit of trouble there. So that's the default. And so very often, if you just ask the question, how do I say this, right? If you just ask that question, very often the answer they give you, it might not be specifically what you're looking for. And so to me, these are the two very broad layers of this problem. So just to recap real quick, we noticed that it's very difficult often for native speakers to explain why something is the way it is. It's difficult for them to give you a grammatical explanation or, things like this. Why are these words spelled that way? Why is the English spelling so crazy and nonsensical if you're not familiar with it? But then the second problem is that it's also sometimes difficult to get the exact information that you're looking for, especially around expressing an idea, certain vocabulary, certain registers of speech. So how do we handle this problem? Well, the first tip I want to give you today is one that I have found to be immensely helpful. And it's a very, very simple technique, which just simply reframes the question of how do I say something? What I like to ask a native speaker is, how would you say this in a natural way, right? And frame the context, right? So, because what happens is, if you say, how do you say this? Very often the native speaker is going to think, oh, there's quite a few ways to say this. And then they'll start thinking and sort of asking themselves questions. They might start to doubt themselves. I think this is also one reason why it's very important to think carefully about how you're going to interact with native speakers, how you're going to ask them for help. Because if you're not careful, if you keep asking a native speaker, really difficult questions, complex explanations, you can actually make someone feel quite embarrassed. Now, this also depends on the culture, right? This might depend on, a lot of things. But a lot of people can actually start to be a bit embarrassed because it's like, wow, I'm supposed to be a native speaker. I have this learner asking me questions and I can't even explain my own language. It can lead to various things. You may not see the result. It might not lead to a negative interaction, but it may result in that person feeling a little bit bad about themselves, and it may lead them to being hesitant, and they might give you a sort of very safe answer. But that's not what you want. You want a native speaker to be kind of bold when they give you these answers. You want to really know, no. I don't want to know what the textbook says. I don't want to know the formal thing. I want to know, how would you express this? So I think it's important to help native speakers that we go to, especially those who are not language teachers or not familiar with teaching languages, give them confidence, right, in themselves and in the responses they give you. So that's why I like to say, what's the natural way to express this? For some reason, that framing, it immediately narrows down the scope of the question. It immediately just feels intuitive to the native speaker. There's something, like I said, I think this word is important, intuitive. You want this process to be as intuitive as possible so they just know what you're asking for. So in the case of Japanese, if I were to ask someone, how would you say this in a natural way to your friend, right? Well, immediately then, we have shaved off all the other layers. We're not going to be using keigo. We're not going to be using this sort of formal way of speaking. We're not necessarily going to use the really slang way, but maybe we are, right? But you've now given them a context, and you've specifically said, how would you express this in a natural way? Because very often, if you can do an experiment, if you ask it in 2 steps, if you say, how do you say complicated? I don't know. And maybe they give you a response. Sometimes if you say, does that sound natural? They'll say, no, I don't think anybody would say that. What we would actually say is this. Because here's the thing. When you say, how do I say the word complicated? Well, they're going to search for a one-to-one translation, right? But here's the thing. Very often in a second language or whatever, they wouldn't use the same word, right? They would express that idea using different terms. So that's again why when you ask, how would you naturally express this idea? Then they're likely to say, well, the translation of interesting or complicated is this, but we would probably say this other thing. That's how we would express this emotion or this feeling. So, it's pretty simple, but I have found that is the most helpful and effective question you can ask a native speaker to get the information that you're likely looking for. And of course, if you want the formal way of saying something, or if you're looking for those different contexts, again, you could say, if I were in a business meeting, what would be the most appropriate way to express something? And then all of a sudden that changes it again. But in both of those situations, you're really helping them give you an intuitive response. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is a really helpful sort of framework, if you will, that I have found is very effective when I have native speaking friends of a language that I'm going to be interacting with often, right? So if it's a friend, right, and you're seeing this person frequently, and this is especially good if it's a relationship partner. Now, this is a whole different topic, which I think is an amazing one. I would love to make a video on how to effectively learn a language with a partner or spouse, because many of you will have probably found out that that is not as easy as it often seems. But this is great for any of these situations. What you can do is, instead of telling someone, hey, if I make a mistake, please let me know. I want to know everything. Let me know every single mistake. I want to know. Well, 2 things can happen. The first thing is you might actually start to feel very discouraged, because very often, you build up some confidence. You're comfortable communicating, but you may not be aware of all the different little mistakes you're making. And so if someone starts pointing out every single mistake, that can really start to damage your confidence, and that's not what you want, right? If you're looking for feedback and you're looking to improve your language skills, it's important to do so in a way that's productive, constructive, and that helps you boost your confidence, right? Boost your skills, not damage the confidence that you have communicating. The other thing that can happen is that it can be quite stressful for the other person, right? It can be very stressful if you now have the responsibility of looking for every single mistake. Certain cultures are, very averse to giving critical feedback. So again, in the case of Japan, sometimes Japanese people can feel quite awkward about correcting you on a simple mistake, because maybe they're worried that you'll be upset, maybe they're worried you'll feel offended. So it can be quite a stressful situation. And I suppose the third thing that can happen is that it can just totally ruin the communicative rhythm, right? It's very hard to maintain a good conversation if someone's like, you made a mistake here. Like, wrong tense, there should be a S on the end, whatever. Like, it can be very awkward. So here's what I have found. What I have found to be so helpful is asking somebody for what I think of as sort of thematic errors, common errors, things that I'm doing over and over again. Now, a good example here is, I've had many friends over my life, who have been learning English as a second language or a third language, whatever it might be. And, if they don't tell me that they're looking for feedback, right, then I'm not really inclined to give it to them, because if the goal is to communicate and we're communicating perfectly fine, then mission accomplished, right? There's no reason for me to suddenly, I don't want to damage their confidence. I don't want to, give unwanted feedback, But if somebody were to ask me, hey, I'm looking for feedback on my English, but I just want you to tell me, the common mistakes that I make over and over again, right? So I don't want to know every single little detail, but if you notice thematic errors, things that I constantly get wrong, I'd love to know those things. Well, very often, that's actually a very easy task for me to do. So I have certain friends who, you'll notice if you have multiple friends from the same country or the same language background, very often those people will tend to make the same mistakes, right? Due to certain linguistic features of their language. So I've had several friends who will confuse sort of words like interesting versus interested, right? So what they will say is, oh my God, I'm so interesting in this topic, right? What they mean to say is, I'm so interested, right? But the same person will also say, oh, I'm so exciting about the movie next week, when what they really mean to say is, I'm so excited. So what I have found, and again, I've done this in both directions. So I've done this myself as a native speaker of English and helping my friends learn English, but I've also used this technique in languages like Japanese, French, Spanish, where, people have sort of helped me. And the funny thing is that if you talk to someone frequently, very often you really start to build up a pretty good sort of profile of this person's common mistakes, right? And so the cool thing is that if we take this same example and we help that friend and we say, by the way, whenever you sort of want to express as an adjective, like I am interested, right? I am excited. Well, it's excited, interested, intrigued, these kind of things. If you fix it in that one place, then you fix it everywhere, right? So that's the power of this, because, if you're learning a language, it's an incredibly high bar, even just to get to this like near native level where you may still make some mistakes, but very, very few. That's a very, very, very high bar, right? And so it's unlikely that most of us are going to be perfect, right? We're always going to make some mistakes. So it's not super helpful to necessarily, have someone point out every single thing. But what's really helpful, what's really going to help you improve your language skills by leaps and bounds, is identifying those things, identifying those common mistakes that you're just making in like every single time you use this particular grammatical structure, or, maybe you're constantly getting the plural and the singular wrong. I have a few friends who this is a common mistake, where they might say, oh, I have to take some note on my class, when what they mean to say is, I need to take some notes right? So again, if you fix that in one place, if you help them understand and practice that one particular error, well, it's going to improve their English dramatically, because all of a sudden, maybe they were making that mistake 1,000 times a day and all of a sudden it's over. They fixed it, right? So that's what I'm interested in when I'm speaking a foreign language and I'm learning a language and I have the luxury of having friends or people who I'm going to speak to regularly. That's what I look for. I want to know, what are all the big common thematic errors that I tend to make all throughout the day, every conversation. If I can fix those, I'm pretty happy. Okay, everybody, I hope that was helpful. Those are just 2 tips. It's a pretty big topic, but I really think that it's a useful one. Have a wonderful Monday, a great new week, and I'll see you back here on Wednesday for another video.